Welcome to another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. It's the podcast that takes a look behind the scenes of the fantasy football industry through interviews with some of the best in the business. For this episode, I was joined by Jorge Edwards of Fantasy and Frames. We talked about a ton of awesome things, including his love for IDP, the trilogy he enjoys watching over and over, his favorite cocktail, the last YouTube hole he was stuck in, creating a fantasy football website, his experience at the Fantasy Football Expo, getting advice from Matthew Berry, and a ton more. Follow Jorge on Twitter or X at Jorge B. Edwards. You can follow me, Kacey Kasem, at DKCKasem, and the podcast at GetReal_pod. My content is found at RotoBaller, Fantasy Six Pack, and South Harmon Fantasy Football. And check out SundayDreamersClub.com for some rad fantasy football inspired t-shirts and sweatshirts. Again, that's SundayDreamersClub.com. This podcast is a proud member of the DAP Network. And now, here's my conversation with Jorge Edwards on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. Jorge, thanks for joining me on Get Real with Kacey Kasem. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. I've been a fan of yours for a really long time, and I've known you a long time in this industry, so it's going to be really cool to get to know you and all that. So, yeah, really thank you so much for coming on the show.
Kacey, thank you so much. It has been long overdue to speak with you on a pod, and just been a huge fan of everything you've meant to in the space for as long as I've been on fantasy Twitter /X now. I take that back. I'm never calling it X. I can't do it.
Yeah, it's not allowed on the show anyway. Yeah.
Just call it Twitter. So I've been really, really excited ever since we talked about coming on your show. And thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, the pleasure's all mine. The pleasure is all mine. I'm so excited to have you here. And I know people that are listening right now, they know you from Fantasy and Frames, but they want to know more about the guy behind Fantasy and Frames. So let's get started talking more about like your childhood and your relationship with sports. What was your relationship like with sports when you were growing up?
Sure. So coincidentally, my first season watching the NFL was the last season that my team, the Washington Commanders, won a Super Bowl, and it's been kind of downhill ever since. So that kind of put a little damper on the whole the football fan thing. But, just keep having the faith, right?
Right.
So it was that. It was basketball. Those two were my sports. I actually wrestled in high school. So I did that for a few years, and then once I got to college and stuff, that became more of a hobby. Picked up tennis, actually, which is actually kind of like an interesting sport because it's like controlled chaos. Like you have to hit the ball as hard as you can, but you have to have enough finesse that you hit it exactly where you want it to. It was like a game within a game. So that was my experience playing sports back in the day.
Okay. Tennis. That's one of those that I never got into. I know people that play tennis, but it's never really been my jam, but really cool to hear about your experience with it. Okay, so when you were growing up, did you have a favorite player or anybody that you can think of that really stood out to you when you were a child?
When the Commanders won their last Super Bowl, it was the quarterback, and then as I started following more football, it became, more quarterbacks. Unfortunately, the quarterback I'm going to mention now is one that, is one that we shouldn't be talking about, I guess, Brett Favre, but watching all those Packers victories, and then, John Elway, and, it's the quarterback that gets the love there. And then as I've transitioned more and more into becoming more of a fan, my attention has shifted to the defensive side of the ball. So a lot of these linebackers and defensive backs that are out there nowadays, like the edge rushers like Micah Parsons for the Cowboys, just elite players, and getting to know both sides of the ball has really helped me have a more of an appreciation for the game of football, as well as fantasy football and the content we help produce. And so, I like really what I like about sports the most, to be honest with you, Kacey, is that, you take away the names on the back of the jersey. It's what the sport represent and how it rallies people together. Like, I don't know anything outside of maybe music that rallies people together as much as sports does.
Yeah.
I love watching all those sports documentaries on Netflix and whatnot, the Redeem Team one or the quarterbacks one, or you name it. It's just, sports is just it's an integral part of my foundation, and there's so much you can learn from sports. That being people who do not like sports, I'm always kind of like, so what do you do? No judgment, like, but what do you enjoy? I don't get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sports and music, those are two things that I could probably talk about forever. And whenever I hear somebody say that they like an artist or a type of music that I like that's in the fantasy football community, it's like, man, I found a soulmate, Like, seriously, it's so awesome to talk about music, sports, all of that jazz. So let's figure out how you got involved in fantasy football in the first place. What exactly is that origin story?
It was a cold October evening, and one of my buddies calls me, and he's like, hey, we had somebody bow out of our fantasy league. Would you like to take over the league for the rest of the season? And it was a redraft league. I knew nothing about fantasy football. I knew about the players that I watched on Sunday. I didn't know what their fantasy value was. I couldn't tell you anything about them. And he's like, okay, well, here's the situation. Your quarterback's done for the year. You're going to have to probably stream a quarterback for the rest of the season. I'm like, I have no idea what these words mean, but fine. We'll go with it. And so I joined the league, and not knowing a thing about what I'm doing, the only thing I did do right was I picked off Tim Tebow off the waiver wire, and that was the year that Tim Tebow was a monster in fantasy with the Denver Broncos that one season where he led them to a win over the Steelers in the playoffs. And I actually came in like fourth, and I'm like, wow, from having no quarterback, know nothing about fantasy football to now coming in fourth and rallying to be in the playoffs. I thought that was a pretty good accomplishment. And then, the next year I got into another league and then another league. And then, friends leagues mostly don't, although I would always go on like ESPN and join those public leagues just to have some fun, just because, once you start drafting and building up leagues add up quickly, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I just started getting into it. And then I started getting into like, IDP fantasy football with offensive fantasy football. And so next thing you know, I'm being introduced to leagues where it's like, well, now we have actual defensive players that you have to memorize. I'm like, what? Like, it was such a novel concept to me. And so, ever since those early days, it's really helped shaped my my focus as to what I like in terms of fantasy football content and what I find important and helpful, really. But yeah, it was about like mid 2000s when all that went down. Obviously with Tebow, I think that was 2009 or so, 10, something like that. So it's not as long as a lot of people who they're like, oh, I was doing this back when we had magazines and we were mailing in our rosters weekly. That's not as far back as I go, but once I started becoming a fantasy football junkie with everything, I was all in.
Yeah, I'm always like blown away when people come on here and they talk about their experience drafting and setting up their lineups and everything when they had to just call in their lineups and use the newspaper and then, transitioning to magazines and all that. Old school on that. How did you do research when you first started on the players that you wanted to draft, or did you just go with your gut? Exactly how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, there was some gut feeling to it. Like, there was this point in the early stages where it's like, well, let me get my quarterback in the first round, something that's sacrilegious to do nowadays, right? Amongst the people who know better. But I would go after the big names. I would look at the previous year's scoring, and I'd be like, okay, well, this person scored the most at this position. Let me prioritize that. Let me prioritize the names that I know that are on good offenses that score a lot of points on Sunday. And then I started listening to more and more podcasts and just kind of absorbing everything that just was being said. And, a lot of it was gibberish to me at the time because I didn't know what to make of the terminology and whatnot, but I just kept on plugging away, listening to it. And then I finally was able to one season start listening to podcasts and watching football. And then it started to click. It's like, oh, that's what they meant by this. And that's what they meant by that. So like being able to actually see it in real time as you're listening to a podcast during the week really helped me become better at playing fantasy football.
Okay, so you brought up the IDP aspect of fantasy football, and IDP is something that isn't as popular as a lot of different types of leagues, but it is gaining a lot of popularity. It's gaining traction, and more people are playing it now. How did you decide, hey, we need to incorporate IDP into our league?
So, it was one of those things where the IDP leagues that I was in, when I mentioned earlier that my couple friends would like invite me to their leagues, they were IDP leagues. And for the longest time, I didn't know what it was like to play in a fantasy football league with a defense special teams. I was like, when I first encountered a league like that, I'm like, wow, this is how the rest of you do this. This is amazing. I'm so used to playing with individual defensive players that it just seemed more natural to me. And again, based off your scoring settings, you get to determine which players bring a little bit more value and than others players, just like you do on offense, whether it's a PPR or back in the day the standard or non-PPR way of doing things. But I don't know. I just like it. I just think it's fun. I don't mind learning the new player names. I have an appreciation for it because it really helps with understanding the side of the ball on offense. Like if I know so-and-so is a bad cornerback for NFL purposes, well, I know the wide receiver going at him is going to have a field day. So that helps me with streaming options, depending on the size of your league, and then, applying that to all the different positions.
Okay, so do you have any experience live drafting? Because live drafting is something I could probably talk about for hours as well, What has your experience been like with live drafting, and can you go into more detail about that?
Oh, so I first of all, as we're recording this, and I'm looking behind you and I see all the live draft boards. I am just like that. I love live drafting. First of all, I like throwing parties in general. I'm like one of those people who's like a big party hosting person. Like I'll bring up the theatrics. I'll have the sound system. I'll have everything going, the food, the drinks. So now you throw in fantasy football into that. Oh my God. Right now we're talking about a real party. And so I'll get the draft boards. I'll get the stickers. I'll get the trophy. I'll get the little piece that goes on the trophy with the winner's name each year. I'll write up the league constitution. You name it, I'll get everything ready for that draft. Food and everything. It's just so much fun being a part of a live draft. Yes, sometimes it can take forever, and you're just like, oh my gosh, when will this be done? Depending on how many rounds you have, but there's something about being around people who have the same passion as you do towards fantasy football, and just how much happiness that brings to everybody who's there. Even in 2020, we had to suspend obviously our live draft because of the pandemic. I still ordered a draft board kit. I still ordered the stickers. And even though we were doing it online, like every night after like the timer went off for our draft on Sleeper, I would put the stickers on for everybody which some days that was cool. And there are other days where we were going through like multiple rounds a day. I was like, God damn, this is a lot of stickers we got going on here right now. But yeah, I'll always be in favor of a live draft over just doing it on an app.
Oh man, I should have done that during the COVID year because we didn't draft live in person. We just did it on the app, and it was fun, but it was not the same experience. So let's talk about fantasy football content creation. When did you exactly decide that was the route that you wanted to go down?
So coincidentally, it ties into the year I got married. So going back to 2016, after our wedding, my wife and I, we went on a week-long sabbatical up to New England. We got married on October 15th. And so we took a week-long sabbatical, and we wanted to see the leaves change color, all that different things that you imagine New England being that time of year. And so we have this kind of rule between us when it comes to driving, and that is whoever is driving gets to dictate what we listen to. And so again, it's the middle of which I'm like, okay, that's fair. That's fine. And so she was listening to her musicals and other music. Well, it's the middle of the fantasy football season for me, so I want to listen to as many podcasts as possible. And so I'm volunteering to drive. Oh, you're getting tired, sweetheart? Here, let me take over driving, and quickly change the station to what we're listening to. And that became the norm. And then, she just, by the end of the trip, she was like, so who are they talking about again? I'm like, oh my God, she was really interested. So then I took that as a cue to keep talking about that continuously nonstop up until the following summer, where it got to July 22nd of 2017, and she's like, I think I've absorbed enough fantasy football content from you that I care to at this point. I still love you, but maybe there's like a different group of people who would appreciate it a little bit more than I would. So I'm picking up on the subtlety of what she's trying to throw out there. And so she's like, well, how have you thought about creating a blog and just like writing, your thoughts on that and promoting that? And I could help you set that up. And so she helped me set that up. She's like, well, let's think about a name for your blog. And I was thinking about something. And she's like, well, you wear glasses. You like fantasy football. Why don't you call it Fantasy and Frames? And so I'm like, okay, we'll go with that too. So I tell everybody at Fantasy and Frames the number one boss is not me. It's my missus. And so, which coincidentally is the truth for a lot of other things. But anyhow, sticking to fantasy football, she helped me come up with everything, and she's always been supportive. And she's early on helped me with my graphics work, and she would proofread articles for me. Just really, really instrumental in being supportive. And then as we've grown the brand up, ever since then, and the content number, the quantity of content we put out there, like for her to be so supportive, it's mind-boggling, and I owe her a lot for that. And yeah, so that's kind of where Fantasy and Frames and fantasy football content kind of started from the drive during our honeymoon all the way to July 22nd of 2017.
Yeah, I really love giving shout outs to the spouses on this show because they're so supportive. And if they weren't a part of our lives, supporting us and doing all of that, then we probably wouldn't be where we are right now. So how important has it been to have that support system from your family when you're going into this fantasy football journey?
Oh, it's been, I would not be doing what I'm doing still if it wasn't for the support system that I have around me, and I've had it around me since the get-go. As much as I talk about my wife helping me out, her sister helps me out with creating other logo designs, and would get me posters and stuff of, that say Fantasy and Frames on them, or give me t-shirts or stuff like that, which she would make them as gifts and whatnot. Like, everybody's just been super helpful. Like, my mom would help me get a microphone. My first microphone, my mom got me a microphone because she wanted to support my podcast. And my mother-in-law, she's like, here, how much does your website cost? Here, I'll like little things like that just add up over time. Like, super supportive, super helpful. And then I had my friends who I would tell, obviously I would tell the friends who played fantasy football what I was doing. And they're like, do you need writers? Do you want us to come on and help? And so on and so forth. And I'm like, sure. And it wasn't until early 2018 that I decided I wanted to go into podcasting. Coincidentally, because the fall of 2017, ESPN's Fantasy Football Focus with Matthew Berry and Field Yates and Stefania Bell, they were traveling around the country doing shows at various locations. And one of the locations was in Washington, D.C., which is where I hail from. And so you listen to the show they do, and then they did at the end this, like, you get in line and then you get to take pictures with them and talk to them and so on and so forth. And I remember talking to Matthew Berry very vividly, and I was like, just telling him, like, how do I grow as a content creator? And he said to me, you know what, put out a podcast. Yes, the internet is full of podcasts, but you know what? It's good to get your voice attached to something, have a take put out there by you. And all it takes is one person listening to your show for it to make a difference in what you do. And so going into 2018, that was my goal. My goal was to, start a podcast, but I, at the time, was freaked out as far as like doing podcasting and just having my voice be out there in the ether of the universe. And, I was very fortunate to have one of my close friends. His name is Ken Sonnenberg, and he, not the fantasy football analyst that, a lot of us consider ourselves to be, as quote unquote analysts. But he would do his research, whatever I would say, we were talking about these players today. He would look up their stats. He would make himself knowledgeable enough to have a conversation about fantasy football with me. And that was huge in me getting over my fears of doing a podcast and then becoming consistent with it throughout the following year. And friends and family, to answer your question, long-winded answer, definitely helpful, definitely important.
Okay, yeah, I'm glad that you brought up podcasting. Getting into podcasting and doing all of that, what kind of steps did you take when you first started? Like, where did you go to actually get started putting out a podcast?
So I wanted something very simple. I wasn't trying to get into like this whole like, let me buy, hundreds of dollars of equipment that I don't know how to use or plug in or do anything with. And so at the time, and I don't know if they're there anymore because I think they got acquired by Spotify, but Anchor was a big app that could download onto their phones where you basically talk into your phone and then it turns your audio file into a podcast and it sends it out to Apple or Spotify. So it was the easiest one that I found. I know other people were doing like Podbean or a couple, I forget what other ones they were doing, but Anchor for me was the one where I set up the Fantasy and Frames podcast. And, it was actually painless. It was, it wasn't a lot of prep work needed. I would have my phone sitting in between myself and my friend, and we would just like get close to the phone when we were having our parts to talk and backing away when it wasn't our part to talk, and then hitting each other in the head when we both went in to talk at the same time, But aside from that, yeah, that's how I went about it using the Anchor app.
Yeah, shout out to Anchor. That's what I first started using whenever I started putting out Get Real with Kacey Kasem for the first time. I was like, what do I need to use, And somebody told me about Anchor, and there we go. And now it's Spotify for podcasters or whatever, and that's what I use to upload this now. And I use Podbean for the DAP Network feed, so whenever I upload the podcast there, ends up on the DAP Network feed. Pretty awesome. So had you done anything like this before, like podcast, been behind a camera or a microphone, or, talked in front of people, a big crowd of people, or anything like that before?
No, and not that one bit. And my in retrospect, had I known how much fun podcasting is, I would have gone into something. I would have studied in school something a lot closer to the multimedia than I did studying science. And so, I did not. But let me tell you what, I enjoy it. It's spawned a whole new passion, just being able to talk shop about what you're passionate about, what you love talking about, and getting to meet so many people through doing that. And it's crazy, like going back to what Matthew Berry said to me in terms of it just takes one. It may not mean that's the one person who's going to launch you into stardom. It could just mean, hey, you're so-and-so, right? I listened to your podcast episode. That was really cool. And sometimes for me, if not all the time, hearing that one compliment means so much. It makes every single hour worth it. You know what I mean?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Like, it's a serotonin boost whenever somebody's like, I listened to your podcast, or I read your article, or whatever. Like, that means the world to content creators, to us, to just know that all this time and effort that we're putting into something that we love doing. But it's awesome to know that what we're putting into it actually means something to people. So thank you to everybody that does that. Like, I try to do it, and you should try to do it too. Try to give people that you respect compliments, because it really does. It does make people feel so much better. When you first started putting out podcasts, was there something that you wish you would have known that you learned later on that would have been helpful? Something maybe people who are just starting out might want to know?
I think the first, yes, to answer your question, one thing I will say about, there is a huge difference between podcasting during the NFL offseason and then during the NFL season. So my first 2 years of podcasting, I would have my routine. I would put out my 3 articles a week on the blog or website. And then I would put out, a podcast episode a week. And when I released a podcast episode a week, it didn't matter during the off season, because it's the off season. There's something time pressing about it. You get into the regular season, now you got like waiver deadlines, but the waiver wire podcast on a Thursday means nothing, or your start and sit by Saturday night means nothing. You have to constantly be on these deadlines. And so my first 2 years of doing that, like both Ken and I, we got to the point where it's like, the week before, it's like semifinals week in the fantasy football playoffs. And I'm like, I have zero energy left to record the final 2 episodes. And we found a way to do it. But it is a grind. It is a quote unquote grind that you really have to have a good support network around you to help get you through. Because anybody who tells you, "Oh my God, it is so much fun," being up until midnight on Monday night into Tuesday, and then Tuesday into Wednesday, and then finally getting sleep on Saturday for a few hours, love it so much. Like, no, you don't. It wears you down. What gets you through it is your passion, because this is the stuff that you love. It doesn't mean at the same time, there are aspects of it that you like and don't like. So I would just say, for people who are like new to wanting to get into it, like, understand, like, it is a toll during the season because of the time deadlines. But if you have good time management skills, and are able to really section off parts of your day to get stuff done and have the time to do so, where there's a will, there is a way.
Word. I agree with that. So, okay, let's talk about Fantasy and Frames. That logo is really awesome. So I just want to know, like, who designed the logo for Fantasy and Frames?
Thank you. So the original logo was my wife. She cropped it. It was literally like a clip art of a football, and we found like a clip art of glasses frames, and we just put them on top of each other. And so for the first couple iterations, that was her. And then about a couple years later, I wanted to get something like a little bit more cartoony. And so that's when I learned about the website Fiverr, where you can hire a digital artist and they'll make your logo for you. And so found one that I liked, and we went through a couple discussions. You communicate with your graphic designer, you have input, obviously it's your design, and they work with you. And we came out with our cartoon like design, and I loved it. It was ours for years, and like everything we did had its own custom logo, and it was great. We made t-shirts, yada yada yada. And then one year, do you remember Veridian Global, the company that made t-shirts back in the day?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to make an online store back in the day for Fantasy and Frames, and I wanted to sell merchandise. And one of the things I wanted to do was sell a hat. But they were telling me that, well, the logo that you are using is too big to be printed on the hat. So what if we simplified things a little bit for you? And I'm like, I don't know if that's going to screw with, what we're known for. But when I saw the mock-up originally, the original mock-up, I was like, this looks very simplistic, but at the same time, it gets the point across of what this is. And the guy said, yeah, it's the Nike effect. And I'm like, well, what's the Nike effect? It's like, Nike, what do they have as their logo? It's a swoosh. It's a swoosh, but you automatically know what this is about and what they're talking about. And then I thought about, oh, well, what if we revamp the Fantasy and Frames logo to be a little bit more minimal? And that's where we're at currently.
I love that. I love that. As a fellow glasses wearer, like anytime I see something with like big old glasses on it, like it immediately stands out to me. So I just wanted to give you kudos for that. That's super dope. So, okay, growing the site. I've talked to a lot of people who have built their own websites, have their own fantasy football websites, and it seems like an interesting experience. Not something that I think that I could do, maybe. I don't think so, but like seeing you get started and doing that, how exactly did you get started, first and foremost, and then how did you continue to grow the site?
Sure. So there was a free, again, going back to 2017, there was a free service called Blogger, where you would have limited templates as far as how you would set up your site, but you could make it work. And then that's when, about a year or two after using that, I wanted to get more bells and whistles on the website. And so then that's when, coincidentally, my wife, when she was designing her website, talked to me about WordPress.org compared to WordPress.com. And I was like, well, what's the difference? And she's like, well, .org, you own your stuff. .com, you don't. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes a lot more sense. And so I set up my website on WordPress.org. I use a hosting company. I use Bluehost currently. And, it gave me all these templates to kind of choose from and how I wanted to set up my site. And I'll tell you what, like, it took a while. It took a while for me to like play around with the features and to, not that it was difficult, it was just the paralysis by analysis. Like when you have so many options in front of you, it's like, where do I even begin? But then once you go down the rabbit hole and you find a template that has a bunch of the features you want, and it grew. And as the site grew, the number of people that we have on the website doing content started to grow. And even then, I want to say until a couple of years ago, there'd be times where I'd be up at like 3:00 in the morning making tweaks to the site, and I'll be in our group chat like at 2 a.m. Hey, everybody, guess what I'm doing at 2:00 in the morning because I'm not in bed right now. I'm making a change to the website. And then I'll send a massive text message like 4 o'clock. It's like, hey, I'm still working on the website. It's really going well. And then like 7 a.m., I'm like, I think I went too far. And I have to backtrack down. So it becomes more of like a fun addiction than anything else. But that's how we grew it. Yeah.
Hey everyone, Kacey Kasem here. I want to take a moment to tell you about Sunday Dreamers Club, my fantasy football inspired t-shirt store. If you're looking for unique, stylish, and comfortable apparel that showcases your love for fantasy football, look no further than SundayDreamersClub.com. Whether you're gearing up for the next big game, hosting a draft party, or just want to sport some awesome gear, Sunday Dreamers Club has got you covered. With a variety of designs and styles to choose from, there's something for every fantasy football fan out there. Your support means the world to me, and there are so many ways you can help me grow this new small business. Grab a shirt or two for yourself or as a gift for your fantasy football league mates, or you can spread the word to your friends and family. Every bit helps, and I truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the show. Okay, so bringing in more people to put out content for the site, you have visual and audio and writing and all of that fun stuff. How did you bring in more people for the team, and what was that process like?
The next two people who reached out literally DM'd me and one found me on LinkedIn, and they both were like, hey, we read some of your articles that you've been posting on Twitter, listened to a couple of your podcast episodes. Are you looking for somebody to write? And I'm like, sure, that would be awesome. And so I got to know them clearly. And then they're like, well, I have a friend who would be interested in doing this. And then they had a friend, and then they had two friends, and so on and so forth. Yeah, referencing Wayne's World there for those who don't understand the movie reference. But anywho, it grew into that. And, I'll always be grateful for the people who have been with us, pretty much for the long haul since we expanded. Nate Markham, want to give a shout out to him. He, just one of my closest friends in and out of this space, somebody who has been with me, helping me churn out content, for years. I say this a lot. Without Nate Markham, you can follow at Nate Markham on X. There you go. There's a little plug right there for Nate. There would not be Fantasy Frame still standing if it wasn't for him and his contributions. And I really owe a lot of my success, and most importantly, the brand success to what he's been able to accomplish for us.
Yeah, shout out to Nate. Nate is someone that I've known for a while in this space, and he is such an awesome dude. So yeah, great support system there, and just shout out Nate. Okay, so when you consume content, what is the kind of content that you like to consume? What really draws you in and brings you into content that you're consuming?
So I can go on any, big name website like an ESPN or a Yahoo or a Fantasy Pros, and I can read a cut and dry article. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I just mean like I can read your basic, well done written article talking about this is why you should get into this player. This is why you should not. Okay. Well, if everybody can do that, I want to do something different. So what I tell people when they're writing content at Fantasy and Frames is like, I want to read your article like you're having like a conversation with me. Like treat your audience as if they're your friend. And if you want to be sarcastic and have a sarcastic tone, put a sarcastic tone in there. If you want to, be I don't even know where to go from there. But if you want to be sarcastic, we'll just leave it at that. Be sarcastic. Give your takes. Make sure they're supported. I am not a fan of hot takes. Like I get they're clickbait, but like if you're gonna take a stance on something, you better support that and have the facts right. But at the end of the day, if you have a stance on a player or a situation and you're able to support what you're talking about, like I'll have your back no matter what, regardless of the feedback that people may agree or disagree with. Like, look, you did the work, you did the research. Like, I'm always going to give the benefit of the doubt to the content creators there. As far as like the content that I go out there and consume, I don't really consume too much. I kind of don't like to have my fantasy content creation opinions based off of too much of what's already out there. I like to like form my own conclusions. So where people are listening to other podcasts or watching other YouTube videos, I'm like on fantasydata.com or some statistics website or Pro Football Focus, and I have like all these numbers in front of me, and I'm just like, all right, speak to me. Well, this is like the Matrix, or I see nothing but code. Like, show me the winner. Here we go. And I like diving in that way, and just getting an idea for what the trends are with player performances, and that's kind of like my approach to how I do content creation as well as consuming content.
Okay, so having a bunch of content creators under the Fantasy and Frames umbrella, it seems kind of like a family. You guys connect, and even though there's different personalities and different opinions on players and things like that, you have to make sure that everybody gets along and vet these people that are coming in to work for your brand, kind of represent you. So how do you go about that?
The Fast and the Furious movies with Vin Diesel and how there's like that catchphrase where he's like, I don't have friends, I have family. That's kind of like how I view Fantasy and Frames. Like, if I should have the Vin Diesel gif ready to go at all times, or GIF, I guess is how it's pronounced. But anyhow, we have our introductory meetings where we meet each other on StreamYard or on Skype or whatnot, and I just tell them what we're about. I tell them like we're a bunch of humble people who just like to talk about talk ball. For me, though, what I've made it clear to every single person who's come on board at Fantasy and Frames is family, physical, mentals, then fantasy football is the order in which I rank priority to everybody who's a part of the team. If you need time away, take time away. If you need to take a break from doing all content, cool. You're always welcome to come back later on when if you ever feel ready for it. Or if you need somebody at 3:00 in the morning because Jorge doesn't have normal sleep patterns, as I told you earlier. If you need somebody to talk to, if you're going through a rough time, if you're part of the team here, you just inherited a new friend. So I make it very well known that the person's quality of life matters more to me than fantasy football content, because content can always be made. There's always something to look at, but at the same time, people are more willing to put out content for somebody who cares about their well-being. And at the end of the day, I'd rather have somebody spend their time at Fantasy and Frames, put out 2 articles that tell me that, the best part of being a part of this brand has been how you treat people with the respect you treat people. Cool. You know what I mean? Like, it really matters to me what the people, have to say as far as the brand is concerned when it comes to the quality of the treatment of the people that we have here. And that's kind of how I've approached it ever since.
Yeah, as a content creator, it is super awesome when you work for somebody that actually cares, and I appreciate the sites that I write for because they check in on me, make sure everything's going good, and make sure my mentals are good, make sure everything is going great in my life, and then checking in on me and stuff. So it's really awesome to have that and to have like a support system with a company that you're working with. So just wanted to bring that up and thank you for doing that, because I'm sure that the people that put out content for you appreciate that about you as well. So had you ever done anything like that before, hiring somebody, onboarding somebody? I've never done anything like that. That's why I asked, because it just seems like an interesting experience. So what was your experience like doing that?
It was different. It's one of those things where I would, put out a tweet and say, hey, I'm looking for content creators. Anybody interested? And fortunately, we've hit, a lot. Well, And everybody who's come on, like I always tell the same thing, like, keep your ego at the door. I don't have time or patience for that. We all here support each other. We're here for each other. We're here to help. If somebody's like, hey, how do you study this or research that? Here, I'll help you out with that. I want to foster that family-like atmosphere, that cooperativity. If I tell them, look, if something bugs you before it even becomes a small thought bubble, that's where you come and see me so that we can figure out ways to, oh, well, I'm not interested in doing this. Well, what are you interested in doing? And it's like, okay, well, then let's just do that. I'm pretty flexible with what gets made and how it gets made. I like being in the know and then kind of letting the creative juices flow for everybody else there. But, so once you establish your boundaries and whatnot, it makes the onboarding process a lot easier. When you tell people, like, we're all in this as a team, no one is smarter than the other. We just may have different, skill sets that, other people don't, but that doesn't mean we can't learn. And so as long as you foster an environment and you promote an environment that's all about cooperativity and learning and being humble. Being humble is a huge thing. Again, I'm not a big ego person. Like, people, come to me and they have an ego. Like, you don't get in. The bouncer just said you can't get into the club. You know what I mean? I don't have time for that, and I don't think a lot of brands do have time for that either. Nor should they. So by setting those precedents, it's made the onboarding process a lot easier, actually, to be honest with you.
And then seeing all these creators that you bring on board, they succeed. They're out there putting out awesome content, and they're just growing and growing. How does it feel to see these people just crushing it?
Humble. It makes me feel very humble. Like, I tell everybody, when I first got into this space, it was about me wanting to pay my dues and to put out a lot of content and to be respected as a content creator. Okay, well, what that means to one person can mean something different to another. Sure. I felt at a certain point, I reached a point where I felt like I was respected as a content creator. And I was like, cool. Well, I need to grow Fantasy and Frames. And so if I'm going to grow Fantasy and Frames, that means I got to do a lot more work on the back end of stuff in terms of content production and repackaging of that content. And kind of let the new era of content, writers and podcasters come in here and do their own thing, give them their own space to work with. And so when I see them now and listen to them, hey, I'm going to be on with Bob Harris on Sirius XM, or I'm going to be on with Howard Bender. And I'm sorry for name dropping, but like, when you see like these people getting the success, putting in the work, first of all, that's the first thing. But then seeing the fruits of their labor, seeing their success, seeing them going on radio shows, getting these guests to come onto their shows that we have at Fantasy and Frames, to being asked to being on other people's shows, it's a huge, I will always push their efforts over anything that I do individually, because I want them to get the notoriety, because they're the ones who are putting in the work, and they're the ones ultimately who deserve the attention for that work.
Word. And you put out content as well. So do you have a favorite type of content that you like to put out, whether that be like a specific topic or a type of content that you like to put out? What is your favorite?
Right. So I, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, IDP fantasy football is not that common. And so, for me and Nate Markham, we're kind of the IDP gurus at Fantasy and Frames. And so, whereas other people there can rotate in and out of doing starts and sits and waivers and profiles throughout the year, it's like, okay, where's the IDP content coming from? I'm like, Nate and myself. But we've been growing. Justin Taylor, JT Orange with the Stew, with JT Brew. He's been coming on with Fantasy and Frames doing IDP content. So we're growing the IDP crew. It's growing within Fantasy and Frames. And but I just like it. And it goes back to what I just was saying earlier. Learning about the defensive side of the ball gives me so much more insight on how to approach things for fantasy on the offensive side of the ball. And so I like having like a balanced perspective of things. And I get it. That's not everybody saying they just want to see the touchdowns. They want to see the first downs. They want to see the points. I get it. But me personally, I just like taking it a little bit further than that. And so that's kind of what's either by necessity or just sheer enjoyment of it. It's been the IDP content.
And Fantasy and Frames has a big presence at the Fantasy Football Expo, and I know that it's really awesome to get to see all of y'all out there. And I know that you didn't get to go last year. So can you tell me about your experience with the Fantasy Football Expo?
That's falling down the stairs is never a good thing to do, and getting injured. So it was the first year missing the expo. In terms of my history with it, 2019, it's about June, July, and I get a random email from Bob Lung, which I don't know how he got my email address. I didn't think about it, but he sent me an email. And he's like, I'm putting together something called the Midwest Fantasy Football Expo in Canton, Ohio, home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Would you like to attend? And I'm like, yes, I would. Would you like to have your brand represented at the expo? I'm like, sure. Yes, I would. And so, I was able to get the booth, and my buddy, coincidentally, that my buddy Ken that I keep on talking about, he came out with me there, and we went around the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and I saw the people who were doing the Kings Classic draft. And next thing you know, I see Bob Lung, and I'm like, hey, I'm Jorge. Nice to officially meet you. And we just start chatting, and then he starts introducing me to his friends, and then their two friends, and then their two friends. And then next thing you know, you're like, wow, I'm talking to people who I've looked up in the industry for years, and they're having conversations with me. I am completely awestruck by this and humbled by this. And as I'm having this internal monologue, they're staring at me like, is he going to say anything? I'm like, oh, right. Sorry. Nice to meet you. I'm Jorge. And then at the end of the Kings Classic every year, they would meet up at Buffalo Wild Wings to just, have wings and talk shop and have fun. And so then the people who were attending the expo that year were like, well, why don't we crash this party and just go talk to them directly there? And so I got Brad Evans, Mr. Tequila. I got him a tequila shot. I was talking to Marcus Green. I was talking to all these people that I looked up to for years. And the next day was the expo, and it was fun for what it was. It didn't garner like a huge amount of traffic, but what it did do is introduce me to some really cool content creators in the space, and introduce me to people that I've looked up to for years. And so then in 2020, obviously the pandemic shut things down. So 21, everybody's ready to get out and party and do stuff. And so that's when it got moved to the DoubleTree. And then the numbers for the expo just blew up compared to what it was in 2019. And then he rebranded it just the Fantasy Football Expo, not the Midwest Fantasy Football Expo. And that's where I got to meet Nate and his wife and other members of the Fantasy and Frames team. And then after the expo, Nate tells me, hey, I met Tyler. This is a guy he wants to come on board. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's talk to him. And then the following year, hey, I met so-and-so and so-and-so. They want to come on board. I'm like, okay, well, let's just keep this train going. And I really owe Bob Lung a huge thank you and for the opportunity to have Fantasy and Frames represented there at the expo. And just it is a great place to network. Sure. It is a great place to meet people that are fantasy football fans, and just to talk about what you're all about. And I think one of the things that I take pride in the most was, and I won't name names here, but one individual and his spouse came around, and she knew nothing about fantasy football, and so I was like, oh well, we could tell you if you had any questions. And so we spent like a good 45 minutes just engaging with this couple. And then the week after the expo, somebody puts out on Twitter, hey, so just had a great time at the expo, but I want to shout out the people at Fantasy and Frames because out of all the booths that we went up to, they're the only ones that paid attention to my wife and treated her like a human being, because she doesn't play fantasy football. And the second that they found out she doesn't play fantasy football, they stopped interacting with her. Whereas the Fantasy and Frames group, they were still cool. They still were talking to her. They made her feel like, a person, shockingly. Right. And so that for me was the greatest compliment you could give Fantasy and Frames, because that tells you not just the content speaks for itself, but it's the quality of the people we have behind the scenes running the show that matters most to me.
Excellent. Yeah, my entire family ends up coming to the Fantasy Football Expo every year, like my wife and my dad, and they don't know a whole lot about fantasy football, but it's really cool to see other people kind of engage with them and kind of try to bring them over to the dark side, So, yeah, I have to give a shout out to Bob Long, like I always do, but yeah, he's such a great human being. He's been so supportive of me and my career and just everything. He's just a great dude, and putting together the expo has been such an awesome thing. We appreciate you so much, Bob. And I know I say this every single week on this podcast, but I mean it. Like, Bob Long is such a dope dude. So thank you so much for all of that, Bob.
I do want to give a shout out really quickly, if you don't mind. The team who went last year for Fantasy and Frames, I couldn't make it, but there was Fantasy and Frames representation there. And so, we had one person drive down who's a member of the team from Toronto. Shout out to Chris. We had people flying over from all over the country. And so even though I wasn't able to attend, these individuals really took it upon themselves to represent the brand really well. And really, our friendship just has skyrocketed, ever since then. And so I just want to give a shout out to the Fantasy and Frames team for showing up last year.
Big shout out to everybody over there, all the content creators and everybody that's doing behind the scenes work and everything else. Y'all are awesome. So just keep that up. Keep that up. You already know you have a really great team over there, but I just wanted to let you know one more time that your team is pretty awesome.
Thank you very much. That means a lot.
Going to the Fantasy Football Expo and meeting all these people, it's so awesome. And had you ever actually met somebody from the fantasy football space prior to going to the expo, or was the expo your first time meeting somebody from the fantasy football industry?
Like, I recognize them based off of like their bios or their Twitter profiles, like Scott Fish, I recognized, Gary Davenport, I recognized, obviously, Marcus Grant, I recognized, and Brad Evans, because that was the crew for me, podcast wise, that I listened to so much in my early days of being a content creator. Was like the NFL Network people, the Yahoo people, just mind-blowingly influential. So of course I recognized the people that I looked up to the most. But as far as like, people who are just like myself, who are just starting out, not really, because it was fishbowl time of year and everybody has their custom avatars, and I'm like, everybody should have name tags with their Twitter handles on them, so that was different, but yeah, that's changed over the years a little bit.
Yeah, like I had a hard time. I missed out on meeting a bunch of people just because I didn't know what they looked like, like I'm looking at them on Twitter and I don't know what they look like in real life, so whoops. So yeah, but it's cool to see people out there, to see people from the internet that share the same common interest in fantasy football. Just a really cool experience.
Absolutely. 100%.
Fantasy football is dope. We all know that. And yeah, I love playing fantasy football. You love playing fantasy football, but have you ever attempted to play any other fantasy sports besides fantasy football?
I've tried, Kacey. I really have. I've downloaded, the ESPN basketball app, or I've tried basketball, hockey, baseball, and I really tried baseball because Nate Markham also, when he's not doing fantasy football content, he immediately switches to baseball mode every single year. How he does both back and forth without a break, I have no idea. But he does baseball content for Reliever Recon, and so I'm like, all right, let me pick your brain. Let me look into this. And it's about like 2 weeks later. And like, I'm like, no, I'm done. I can't. But I want to so badly. Like, I want to try. I almost tried fantasy hockey. Like, I went on Twitter one night and I was like, hey, anybody know any cool fantasy hockey people I should reach out to? And they're like, oh yeah, follow this person, follow that person, follow this person. So I followed all of them, but I never fell through with it. So I'm like, at least I know who to talk to when the time's right. But maybe it'll be this year. But so far for me, it's just fantasy football.
And do you watch college football, or is the NFL just what you watch?
I'll watch like the primetime games. Like I'll watch my alma mater, going against the rest of the Big Ten competition and getting destroyed. But whatever. We're not going to talk about that. Go Terps. I'll watch like the primetime games. But for me, it's one of those things where I'm spending so many days during the week. If I don't have the majority of a Saturday with the missus, like, I don't. I want to make sure that her time is recognized, and she's already sacrifices so much for what I'm able to do. So that's the least I can do is give up part of my weekend for spending time and doing out and doing stuff and all that stuff.
Yeah, my wife, she said no college football. If I start watching college football, she's going to leave me. So no college football for me, but that's all right. When you sit down and watch an NFL game, like, how is that experience? If I was to sit down with you and watch a football game, what's your Sunday like?
I can't put my phone down. I can't. I'm that person who, they're like, just sit there and enjoy the games. Enjoy the games. Put your phone down. Put it on, silence or vibrate. Don't check your score. Check your score after the days. Like, you can do that. But I've just spent, 72 hours, 4 days worth of time making fantasy football content information. Like, you better believe I'm going to be following my phone and see if it all paid off really well or not. But it doesn't bother me. Like I'm not the one who gets super riled up and starts like yelling at the TV screen or whatnot. Like I just there's a lot of patience. There's a lot of calm patience there. Unless it's a rivalry game. My wife's a Cowboys fan. I'm a Commanders fan. And so needless to say, she's had the advantage in that for quite some time. So when that happens, then it gets a little bit more lively in the Edwards household. But for the most part, I'm pretty chill, just watching the game, watching my phone for my fantasy scores, and got my food next to me and got my pizza right there. We're good to go. It's pretty chill otherwise.
Another shout out for your wife. Shout out for being a Cowboys fan, for sure. Like all my family, I get it. All my family on my dad's side up north in Pennsylvania, they're all Philadelphia Eagles fans. So, I get the rivalry. I get the texting back and forth. I can't do the whole text. No, I can't. So, you know how it is. When you have free time, when you have downtime, what do you like to do? I know it's kind of crazy to wrap your brain around having free time, but what do you like to do when you do have free time?
This is going to sound so boring. Like I'm a movie person. Like I'll watch movies that like I've seen a billion times, and I'll watch them a billion times more just because I like them for a reason.
Yeah.
I'll go down the YouTube rabbit hole of just watching random stuff. I'll go out to dinner with my wife, or I'll go out and get some food with a couple of my friends. But a lot of my friends moved away after college, so it's been I have my internet friends that I have more connections with than I do local friends. Just I'll watch some other sports, but to be honest with you, fantasy football takes up a lot of time, and it's not I don't mean to say that like in a bad way. It's like, Jorge, learn how to make this graphic using this program and see how much more fun it's going to make making content during the season. Okay, I find that interesting. Like I find that's like cool to learn, or I find it extremely frustrating, and it's like never again. But at least I tried to get better at what I'm doing. But when I do peel myself away, it's movies, it's going out. I do like. I have been getting into like mixology and stuff, and like learning how to make different like mixed drinks and stuff. Like I got my martini set right over there, and I got my collection of spirits over there. So doing that every once in a while is fun to do that. Having my neighbors come over, and it's like, okay, like I said earlier, I like hosting, I like entertaining parties and stuff. And it's like, here are all the drinks, samples. Here's your pen and paper. Write down which one you like the most. And so, I don't know. I like doing entertaining crap like that, to be honest with you.
Well, that's hella dope. That's super cool that you're that friend. Like, I'd be over at your house and having a good time. That just sounds really awesome. So, what is your favorite cocktail to make or to drink or both?
Oh, it's a gin and tonic. I'm a gin and tonic. I could drink gin and tonics all day. They're just so smooth and refreshing, especially if you have the gin that has like some citrusy or lemon lime aspect to it, and you add that to some club soda. You're basically drinking Sprite, but getting a nice sweet buzz off of it the entire day, and it doesn't come back and haunt you later. So that's kind of what I'll go with. Beer wise, I know it's going to sound boring to some, but like I'm a Guinness person. Just give me a Guinness, I'll be good year round. And if I deviate from there, man, give me a Line and Kugel summer shandy in the summer, and those are my big three drinks right there.
All right. I'm not drinking the right gin, I guess. Every time I drink gin, it just tastes like perfume to me. So, yeah, I'm definitely not drinking the right gin. My wife, she loves gin and tonics, though, so shout out gin and tonics. You brought up movies. What is your favorite movie to watch over and over? Do you have one?
Oh yeah, it's more of like a trilogy that I watch. It's the Dark Knight with Christopher Nolan trilogy. I think it's the best Batman trilogy done. After that, you have the Marvel movies with the Avengers, and but for me, and there's just so many good Marvel movies that I can't even begin to start rattling them off. But for me, it's the Dark Knight trilogy. The Dark Knight was mad influential, like in my growing up. The Dark Knight Rises I actually found the Dark Knight Rises to be very inspiring. Of like, life can be going in the opposite direction. Things can knock you down. You become, you feel defeated already. There's so many aspects that could be related to life where you're just down in the dumps and you feel like nothing is going your way. And then like to see him climb out of that proverbial hole to kind of regain who he truly was is very inspirational to anybody who's going through some tough times, where it's like, no, you can rise up and climb out of the hole that you're in and retake the power that you have over your life. And so I think that's the message that those films did a good job in communicating to fans, or at least communicating to me. That's what I got out of it, and that's why I watched them so much.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I don't think I've ever watched all of them, but that's a me problem, not a you problem. So you brought up YouTube holes, and I get stuck in YouTube holes all the time. Like, I'll be looking up that guy that was in that movie who starred alongside that chick who was who's sisters of blah, 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 and this, that, and the other. So I get stuck in those holes all the time. Do you remember the last YouTube hole that you got sucked into?
Oh yeah. So there's this guy and his family who he actually was an attorney in Virginia, and he moved out with his family to Alaska, and he created this channel called the Outdoor Boys. And so it's either him by himself, mostly it's him by himself, or him with his kids, where they go out in the middle of the woods during the winter in Alaska. And he's like, I got an axe, I got a blanket, I got some water. All right, I don't even have water. I have an axe, I have a blanket. Here's how you survive in the blizzard in Alaska with just those two things. And he'll make like all these like bushcraft shelters and teach you the tricks of like, this is how you sleep on the ground during a blizzard and still be warm, even though you don't have a tent. Like, it's like random like survival stuff. But the guy is so dorky, which is what makes me glued to the screen, because he's dorky, he's corny, but at the same time, he like during the entire video, he explains his thought process of why he's doing what he's doing. And it leaves me every time like going, man, I think if I watch enough of these videos, I can do this. And so then I brought my wife down to our entertainment center one day, and I'm watching this with her, and I start to say out loud, Melissa, if I watch enough of these, I think I could. And she immediately is like, no, you couldn't.
Do you have a favorite player in the league right now? It could just be somebody that you like, or somebody that's been good for you for fantasy purposes, or whatever. Can you think of a guy?
For me, it would be the for those who are watching, the person over my head, Terry McLaurin for the Commanders. And it's not just about him being a Commander. Obviously, that's my favorite team. But needless to say, things have been kind of rocky for the organization for some time. That's putting it mildly. But to see how he acts on and off the field, to see the class that he has, the work ethic that he has, in refining his craft. And again, I'm a really big fan of people who just come across as humble and act that way. He really just projects that so well that I can't help but root for this guy no matter what he does. So it'll always be Terry McLaurin for me.
That's a great pick. I'm not a fan of Washington because I'm a Cowboys fan, obviously, but I always find myself gravitating towards Washington players when I'm drafting my fantasy teams, and then I start liking them a lot. So, like Chris Thompson and Kirk Cousins and Jamison Crowder, those were my guys, right? And they played for the wrong team, that's all. And so, but yeah, there are guys like that. And I'm sure that you have Cowboys players that you feel the same way about,
Yeah, that's actually funny because every year I will have at least one Cowboy in my starting roster. And my wife will be like, I'm coming down to watch the Cowboys game. I'm like, okay. And she'll cheer. And I'm like, do I have this player on my roster? Yes, I'll cheer too. He's like, am I converting you? I'm like, no. This is just for fantasy. Let's not get it twisted,
So, is there a player on your fantasy football teams that you probably roster the most of?
That's a great question. For me, it would be on the defensive side of the ball for IDP. So one of the jerseys I got hanging up there, Bobby Wagner, longtime Seattle Seahawk, went to the Rams for a year, came back for the Seahawks, coincidentally. Now plays for the Washington Commanders. He's one of those players who, for like the past 10 years, wow, just saying that makes me feel so old. For the past 10 years, has been one of the perennial linebackers of all of football. He's a tackling machine, which means for IDP fantasy football, he's at the top of your list of players you want to draft year in and year out. Their consistency is just ridiculous. So he would probably be my favorite player to talk about there, Bobby Wagner.
Bobby Wagner. All right. Might make you feel old, but you know what makes me feel old is that it's after 8 p.m. and I'm an old lady who needs to go to bed at a decent hour. So this is my least favorite part of the show. It's where I have to say goodbye to the guest. And Jorge, I want to thank you first and foremost for coming on the show tonight and talking with me and letting the listeners get to know more about you. So before we go, can you go ahead and just let everyone know where they can find you, what you have going on, all the awesome stuff with Fantasy and Frames? Just let everybody know.
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at Jorge B. Edwards, but I'd much rather you would follow all of us at Fantasy and Frames, as well as check out our articles and rankings over at fantasyandframes.com. Give us a follow on all the major social media outlets. We really would appreciate you heading over to YouTube and following at Fantasy and Frames there, subscribing, helping us get to our 1,000 viewer or subscriber threshold there. We have numerous podcasts for you to listen to. We have our Dynasty 365 podcast. We have our Fourth and Frames podcast, which is our longest running podcast since 2017. We have Shoot the Gap, which is our IDP podcast. We have a brand new show this year called Fantasy Football Weekly, where we talk to you about just the ins and outs of what's going on in the fantasy community. Immediately after that, we have the Fantasy and Frames Draft Show, where all we do is just draft in various different formats, and it's a lot of fun. And then, obviously, during the season, we have the Fantasy and Frames pregame show going from 8 a.m. Sunday until 12:30 p.m. So lots of ways to listen to us, whether it's in podcast form or YouTube form, but whatever you like, however you like to absorb content, reading, looking at pictures, listening, or viewing videos, we have all different forms of ways for you to enjoy all the content that everybody at Fantasy and Frames produces.
All right, so yes, please go check out Fantasy and Frames, subscribe. Check out all the awesome work from the content creators over there. Go follow Jorge and make sure you check out all of his content as well. Also, make sure you come back next week for another episode of Get Real with Kacey Kasem. And remember to stay rad.
Get real. Time to get real, everybody.